My name is Nathan, and I am a believer in a God. Growing up, I was born and raised in a Christian and God-fearing family. I was sent to a Christian school, and while growing up, I'm a citizen of one of the most religious countries in the world, Indonesia. My entire community around me had always pushed me in the idea of believing in a figure we called God. But it was then that I got a bit curious. I started asking myself this one question repeatedly, day after day after day. And this was the question: why would we need to believe in God? Why? I thought that the answer was simple, but the reality was far from that. I started trying to do a bit of research, trying to get my hands on as many different views and as many different opinions of God as I could possibly get. And it went from asking my own friends and parents of why they would believe in the Christian faith to the extent of online research. I went from listening to lectures from Christian apologist Ravi Zacharias to that of listening to the lecture of the history of physics from Professor Michio Kaku. It went from reading the book Sapiens from atheist historian Yuval Noah Harari to the extent of listening to a religious talk by religious leader Sadhguru. I tried to understand as many different views and beliefs in God as I could possibly can, trying to find one commonality. Yet at the end, I was even more confused. Because just simply the reality is, everyone in this world has a different opinion and view on God. And is that because of our different backgrounds? Is that because of our different families, different cultures, and even that of different life experiences? But no matter how different our views of God may be, one single thing can be found within all of us. That whether you're a Christian apologist or a theoretical physicist, whether you're a historian who denies God, or a religious leader who embraces the idea of God, humanity in general is in need of an explanation. And as I dug in more and more through the months of different religions and beliefs through our history, I have found that God had always provided us human beings with three certain areas of explanation. And that is what I'm here to share today. The first type of explanation that God provides us is simply that of the beginning. God, simply put, explained to us where we come from. Because if you try to understand and find any religion, basically, in any belief system, through our history as a human race, a certain creation story can always be found. It seemed as if all of humanity had always tried to answer this one question: how do we explain everything in our society and environment? And the response to that was a story that, although today may be a fantasy or mythology, yet it provided the people a certain explanation of how all of the elements of their universe came to be. Whether it's that of nature or environment, or even that of the human conscience and mind. There are many examples. One of the examples, simply put, is that of ancient Babylon, from this very famous historic text we now know as the Enuma Elish. It provided a story for all of the ancient Babylonians at the time of how this great god named Marduk helped to restore order into our world and to create the skies, the earth, and the main rivers of ancient Mesopotamia. Or we fast track later, 2,500 years later, to that of ancient Greece. We find another epic poem named Theogony. And it told the story for all Greeks of how the entire universe was created with the birth of various gods. And we certainly see that each of these Greek gods represented a certain aspect of our society and universe. Athena, the goddess of wisdom; Aphrodite, the goddess of love; Gaia, Mother Earth; and even that of Eros, god of sexual desire. And for us today here, in my belief of modern Christianity, of course most of us here know that God created the world in 6 days. The point is, no matter what type of religion it is or what type of belief, they always provided human beings an explanation of the origins of our universe. Yet the question was, why would we even bother listening or trying to explore that? And the answer to that was not just because of mere curiosity. Our need to understand the universe was linked to a certain desire for an explanation of a certain element. An element, an aspect so important for us that we could simply not push out. And that is, of course, us, human beings. For with an explanation of the origins of our universe, these stories of God have also provided an explanation of how we, as human beings, fit into this universe. For example, like that of ancient Babylon in the Numa Elish, Marduk created human beings out of the blood of this one god as helpers for the gods. Or that of theogony in ancient Greece. We see the story of how man was created out of mud by a great god or titan named Prometheus and breathed with the breath of life by the goddess Athena. And there's this great history of how humanity has always faced suffering under the power and the wrath of the gods. And for Christianity, come on, all of us know how we came to be in the Christian belief. The point is, no matter what religion we find or what belief system, God had successfully provided an explanation of the origins of our universe and the origins of us as human beings. And from this explanation, it goes on to the second area of explanation that God provided. For with an understanding of where we come from, God had also provided an explanation of our position in this universe. God basically explained who we are. And we see this through various stories and how the people of the time held their positions in this world. From the story of Enuma Elish, the Babylonians were able to hold themselves and identify themselves as co-workers of the gods, created to help the gods in any way they can, that order can be kept and chaos kept away. Or we see that in ancient Greece. From these stories of the gods and that of theogony, the ancient Greeks identified themselves as simply weak beings in this world of nature. They were simply weak and powerless and in need of the gods for their compliance, help, and protection. And from the various stories of that modern Christianity found in the Bible, we as Christians and many others are able to identify themselves as servants and friends of God who fell into sin. All of these examples and all of this impact that these stories of God had provided allowed us to know a certain position of ourselves. Through the stories of God, humanity had been able to establish a certain God-given function for them to live out their lives in this world. And that translates today as a certain impact. God provided what many now call purpose. He gave us a purpose in which, how, and why we are supposed to live in this world. He gave us a certain identity that we are to hold as human beings. And most of all, He provided us with some meaning for us to live our lives in this world. And so, God had provided for us an explanation of where we come from and who we are. But with all of this explanation, one last question remains. How? How do we do it? How do we fulfill the purpose that God had provided in us? How do we fulfill and do this God-given function that we have as human beings? And history provides all the stories that we needed. Like, one perfect example is the oldest story in the world, the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's over 4,000 years old and it's from ancient Mesopotamia. And well, the story was basically of a semi-divine king trying to pursue immortality. But the reason it was such a famous text for the ancient Mesopotamians was because of the values it discussed. Through the adventures of this reckless and great king, people were able to learn of certain values like love, friendship, and even of the essence of human mortality. Or we go then to ancient Greece with two very famous texts that are even famous until today. Homer's The Iliad and the Odyssey. Almost everyone identifies these texts today as literature classics. But to the ancient Greeks, it was their truth. And the reason the Iliad and the Odyssey were such influential texts was also not because of its stories. The Iliad and the Odyssey told of the adventures of men like Achilles and Odysseus, reaching their goals with intervention from the divine. But that wasn't the point. The Greeks were able to identify from these characters and their adventures of how all of the Greeks were able to be unified for a certain purpose. These stories from Homer provided the Greek people with certain values and ethics. It talked of the important priorities of honor and virtue, a certain character that the Greeks were supposed to hold on as they live on with their lives. It showed them the Greek character. And for Christianity, there are various other stories in the Bible where we see stories of somehow man trying to disobey against God, or God's power against man. And even sometimes the Bible provides certain simply laws or instructions that shows how we are supposed to live as children of God. All of these stories, texts, myths, poems, and even laws, they're all seem to be very different, but they provided the same need. To show philosophical teaching, show certain morals, values, priorities, provide a conduct of what is right or wrong. And at the end, provided to humanity a certain direction and how they're supposed to live their lives. Where we come from, who we are, and how we ought to live. All of this explained by God. And that was it. As I tried to sum up everything that I had gotten these past few months, and I tried to look back at all of my research and make a certain conclusion. Yet, as I tried to look back at all of this research, all of this study and learning, I realized something. All this research, all of this study, it never really was research. It was an exploration. I had always tried to explore who God is and His very nature in our lives. Yet at the same time, I explored a lot of where I came from. I explored in who I am. And I explored more and more of how I'm supposed to live in this life. And although even today many of you here may believe in God or not, yet we at the end of the day are all human beings in the middle of an exploration. We are all trying to answer these three questions and needs within us, whatever the way. Whether you're a believer or an atheist, whether you believe in what is seen or unseen, whether you rely on fact or fiction. At the end of the day, we're all simply beings trying to answer certain questions and needs within us. You know, concluding everything that I've said today, I'd like to end with a certain verse. It's a Bible verse, and it's very famous in the Christian faith. It's Proverbs 1 verse 7, and it reads like this. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Now, many of you might say that this verse is simply a Christian statement, a religious one. But to me, it's a world statement. Every person in this world is in pursuit of knowledge. It is our desire to try to understand of our origins, of where we come from, trying to understand all of the elements of the universe around us. It has been our constant desire for knowledge and understanding who we are, find a certain purpose, gain a certain identity, find what we may call meaning. And it has also been the great need for us to gain knowledge, the advice, the wisdom from other people and from other stories that show us a certain guidance in how we should live our lives. And although now there are so many ways in which we try to answer these three questions and needs within us, like that of science, philosophy, or religion, but the idea of believing and exploring God, developing a fear of the Lord. People may say that God may be out of reach, and He probably is. He's way too illogical for us to imagine. But when we learn to try know Him, try understand Him, when we develop the importance of having faith, surrendering, and believing in God, and once we even have the chance of understanding His love, we are capable of knowing more of ourselves than we have ever had before. And that's the beauty of chasing God. Thank you.